It is time for another studio talk, and there's so many things. I still have questions that have been submitted that I want to address, and please keep sending them if you have any. There's so many things on my mind and things I would like to talk about. But in my last talk, I mentioned that during a period of my life that felt really depressing, that I felt that the two things that had sort of saved me or pulled me out of that were creative expression and my practice of praying the Rosary and Mother Mary. And several people had asked me if I would talk a little more about the Rosary practice and about my walk with Mary. And so I decided that that's what I'm going to talk about today. I think one of the things that's really beautiful about Mother Mary and praying the Rosary is that she speaks to everyone. She belongs to everyone. And, you know, there is God and there's religion and there's the church. And these are kind of three separate things. And sometimes those three separate things play together nicely and do beautiful, wonderful things in the world. And sometimes they don't. And maybe you are pagan, or maybe you are something else or nothing else spiritually that you identify as, but you still are drawn to Mary, images of Mary. And I think that's all good. I think it's all beautiful. So anyway, here's my story. As I mentioned before in my last talk, I really think of my 20s, the decade of my 20s, really into my mid-30s. Is that right? What time is it? I don't know how even old I am. Anyway, my 20s were really difficult, very difficult. I was extremely unhappy. I found myself in my mid to late 20s, physically not feeling well, emotionally, spiritually not well. I was in a relationship that was extremely unhealthy, and no one really knew it because I didn't really talk about it. And from the outside, I think everything looked fine. From the inside, things were far from fine. I felt lost. I forgot who I was. I didn't know who I was, and I didn't know what to do, and I felt like my life was going woefully down the wrong track, and I didn't know how to get it back, and I didn't even know what the right track was or where it was. I mentioned that the first step, the first thing that sort of happened that helped pull me out of that situation was joining a writers group, and at that time I was living in Park Slope, Brooklyn. And I joined it was a group called Brooklyn Writers. And as a result of being a part of that group, I applied to graduate school and began to pursue my MFA in fiction writing. When I got into school, the fall that I started graduate school, I actually moved out of the city into the suburbs of New York to be close to campus, which was great because I was ready to be not in so much of the city feeling anymore. So going to school, really paying attention to my writing, living in Bronxville, that was all really good. Those things felt good. The relationship got worse, and the situation that I was in became, in that regard, very, very bad. So along that time, around that time frame, that second year of graduate school time frame, so that would have been 97 or 98, somewhere around in there, a very dear friend of mine, who is significant in this story for other reasons as well, who had been raised as a Roman Catholic but was no longer religious at all, gave me a box. And in this box were rosaries and prayer cards and religious artifacts that had belonged to his very devout mother, who was now deceased, and his sister, who also deceased, who had been a novitiate nun. So this was a really powerful box of objects. I didn't particularly feel worthy of receiving it. He gave it to me because he, as a non-religious person, didn't really want to have these things in his possession anymore, but he couldn't get rid of them because they belonged to his family, who he loved very much, and he knew how important they were to them. And so he sort of gave them to me to be like a keeper, like a to safeguard them, to keep them. And I started going to used bookstores and buying everything I could find about Mary and about praying the Rosary. And this is one of them. I still have all of them, of course, and they're very beautiful. This is one that's like mother of pearl. I have one downstairs at my kitchen altar, actually, that is engraved that it is from Lourdes, which is very precious to me. So I started reading about the Rosary, and at that time I wasn't going to church at all. I didn't think at that point in my life that I would ever be a part, really, of a church again. I didn't think I would be wanted in one. I didn't think it would be my thing. But I always had this feeling in the back of my mind, like, I would like to go back to church. Or there was an Episcopal church in my town, and I went there a couple of times, but I don't know, it was like this weird push and pull thing with church. But so I wasn't going to church at that time at all, and I did not consider myself to be religious at that time, but I was very interested in Marian apparitions, in Marian devotions, and in learning to pray the Rosary, which I did. And so I learned to pray the Rosary the Roman Catholic way, because those were the books I had, and those were the rosaries I had. In the Episcopal Church, there are Anglican prayer beads, which are different than this rosary, and they don't have the same prescribed prayers. And I've never prayed the Anglican prayer beads because I've always had my rosaries, or I've had my rosary since 1998. But anyway, at first the prayers were really, some of them, very hard for me because they have that patriarchal language of the church. They speak about sin in a way that at that time made me feel very uncomfortable, because at that time I didn't know the true definition of the word sin. And so the part of the Hail Mary where we call ourselves sinners was real difficult for me to say at that time, because I thought that sin meant like breaking a rule or being a bad person. And I didn't think I was a bad person, and I didn't want to say that. And now I know that that's not what that word means, and we're all good with that. But at that time I didn't. And so it was very difficult. It was very challenging. And yet I was so drawn to it. And I was in this time of my life where I felt despair, really despairing about my life. And even though these wonderful things were happening, and I had this beautiful place to live, and I was getting a wonderful education at a school that I loved, and I was writing, and I felt very dedicated. All of that was really good, but my personal life and my feelings about myself and that whole area not going well at all, and had actually moved into the range of being frightening to me. Like I don't know what's going to happen here, but I don't think it's going to be good. So I started to sleep with a rosary on my bedside table, and I started to pray the Rosary, and more often than not, I would just begin to pray the Hail Mary, and I would just pray the Hail Mary over and over and over again. I was also reading other things at this time, a lot of books about angels, books about intervention, people who had prayed for intervention and received it, people who had felt protected in their lives. So all of this kind of information was sort of swirling around in my head, and oftentimes I was just simply holding the Rosary, even if I wasn't saying the prayers. I was praying just by touching or just by holding it, which is still something I do. I really debated with myself about like if I want to tell this part of the story, but I'm going to tell it because one morning I was lying in my bed. I was awake, but I still had my eyes closed. I was not dreaming. I was not hallucinating. I was just lying there in the morning. The sun was up. The light was coming through the bedroom. From the upper right-hand corner of my bedroom, from the ceiling, I heard a woman's voice say my name very clearly, very distinctly, completely kind, nothing weird about it other than it was a disembodied voice. But it scared me. It shocked me. It was auditory. It was not inside my head. It was something I heard. And so it scared me, and I screamed. And as soon as I screamed, I thought, oh no, I shouldn't have screamed, because whoever that is benevolent. I can feel that it's benevolent. It's nothing weird. And now that I've reacted in fear, it probably won't happen again. And I wish I knew who it was. And I wish I knew, is that somebody trying to help me? Is that somebody or something? Is it some aspect of God answering a prayer? And I still think that it was, and no, I never heard it again, and I don't know what it was or who it was. And I'm certainly not implying that it was the Virgin Mary, but it is important, I think, in this context that this happened during this time period. Shortly thereafter, and at this point I had graduated, I, through holding a rosary in my hand and focusing on the belief that I was seen and heard and protected, was able to extricate myself from a situation that was detrimental to me and frightening, and get through a moment that felt threatening, that felt like I'm alone and I don't know what's going to happen, and I don't know if I'm safe. But having the rosary, praying the rosary, holding it physically, and being in communion with God, with angels, with the Blessed Virgin Mary, gave me the strength. It surrounded me in strength. It put the voice in my throat. I was able to speak and say what I needed to say, and I was safe, and I was held safe, and made it through that passage of time, which I'm realizing now as I'm telling the story, I can't really explain to you why that was or how that happened. It's not like the Virgin Mary, appeared in front of me and, put me on a cloud and took me away, but it was kind of like that, energetically. I just without a doubt can tell you that I feel that I was protected and guided and shielded in that moment through divine intervention because of my rosary practice and because of my crying out for help and asking for help. There is a Catholic tradition that says that when you hold one end of the rosary, Mother Mary holds the other. And that was the image that I had in my head, and that's how it felt to me. Like a life preserver. Still to this day, to me, the two most powerful prayers are the Hail Mary and the Our Father. And when I'm feeling scared, if I'm nervous, if I wake up in the middle of the night and I feel spooked by something, if I'm not sure what's going on, if I feel out of sorts, down, weird, unsafe, anything bad, I pray those two prayers, and that kind of resets my energy and makes me feel like, okay, I'm all right. Studying Mary, studying her role in the church, different ways that people have experienced her, the symbolism of her story has been really crucial to me and important to me in my faith, as well as Mary Magdalene in a different way. But having that sacred feminine, having that to turn to and to see that the feminine is actually an extremely important aspect of Christianity was really vital to me in going back to church and being able to be a part of a church. In thinking about the rosary and rosary prayer, I think it's important to remember that the Rosary and the practice of praying with beads is really old, like it's pre-printing press. And so the way that we think about religion now, and the way that we talk about and we teach one another about God, and we talk about God, we're literate, and so we can read sacred texts for ourselves, and we can participate in this completely different way. But before that happened, and when literacy wasn't as widespread, and before the printing press, any kind of spiritual practice or spiritual devotion or religious belief, all of that was passed down through other people, word of mouth. It was storytelling, and it was things that your priest said, but also things that your family said, and things that you heard around a campfire at night or heard around the hearth at home. And the Rosary really doesn't come from the church. The Rosary comes from that. It's a much older, much older in its origins. And I think that you can find counting prayers on beads or physical objects, physical forms of prayer. You find that in so many other religions as well, and spiritual practice. The use of knotted ropes to pray goes all the way back to the desert fathers and mothers. And yes, there were desert mothers. You just never hear about them. But that's the 3rd and 4th century that that goes back to. There's also in 1075, I found this reference of Lady Godiva referring in her will to the circlet of precious stones which she had threaded on a cord in order that by fingering them one after another, she might count her prayers exactly. So this is a pretty long-standing practice of physically praying, of counting your prayers on beads. So I'm someone who believes in signs. I believe that we all are in communion and connection and dialogue with the divine. And while certainly I think sometimes we can get carried away with that idea, that concept that, is this a sign or is that a sign? I mean, I think it's far less common than we like to think sometimes. But I do believe in it. I do believe in that. I believe that exists for all of us. And when I look back through my life, I can look back and see where things were signs, where there were clear, unmistakable points of guidance or significant, like, I don't believe in predetermination, but there are some things that are meant to be, and I can look back and say, okay, that had to happen, that was meant to be, this is why this happened. So one of those things for me is the telephone pole sign advertising the Brooklyn Writers Group, and it pulled me in like a magnet. I could not escape it. I wasn't even consciously thinking about it when I tore off the phone number and took it home and called and joined that group. It was like I had to do it. No question in my mind that was a sign for me. And this gift, the gift of these rosaries, was another. It was meant to be. It was supposed to happen in my life, and it was an answer to a prayer. And I firmly believe that this pulled me back onto the correct path that I couldn't even see, gave me the strength to do what I had to do that I didn't think I had the strength to do, spoke for me, held me, kept me safe, brought me back into myself, reminded me and continues to remind me that I am loved and that I am heard and that I'm seen, and so are we all. So that is why the Rosary is so important to me, and why my Marian studies are important to me. It occurs to me that healing and the idea of healing and healing modalities has been a point of focus for me and for my work for a long time. It's a place where I'm interested, and I've learned a lot of different techniques, and I have a lot of different ideas about healing and what healing is. But it occurs to me that to me, praying the Rosary is a healing practice, because that's what it does for me. It helps me heal, and from big things and little things. And healing, of course, is wholeness. And anything that we do, any practice we have that brings us back into wholeness and helps us integrate those pieces of ourselves that have been lost or pushed away, help bringing that all back in, and reminds us who we are, which is beloved children of God. Anything that does that is healing. And to me, the Rosary, that's what the Rosary does. So that's my story. I, it's been several years ago now, wrote a little devotional called Mornings with Mary that was basically just little snippets of journal writing, poetry, collage, things that would come to me when I would be in meditation in my Mary garden every morning. And that, you can have that for free. It's on my website if you want to download it. I would urge you, and I do not speak for the church here, but I personally would urge you that if you have an interest in praying with Mary, if you have an interest in praying the Rosary, that you make it your own, and that you do what feels right to you and create that communion or enter into that communion in your way. Although it is really powerful to pray the Rosary with other people, and there are places online where you can do that. There are people who pray it at certain times of the day, and you can pray it with them. That's one of the reasons why I think it is so powerful, is because these are the same prayers that have been said the same way through years and years and years and years and years, and there's a real beauty and power and significance in that. And when you join your voice with other voices making these prayers, there is something very powerful about doing it. I also believe, by the way, that when I pray with these particular rosaries, I am connecting to the women who owned them and who prayed with them. And even though I never knew those women, I do know them through this practice. And I believe that on some level, some way, they know that I am praying with these beads that were so precious to them. And maybe they don't like it because I'm not Roman Catholic, but I hope that they are okay with it. And I believe that they are, because we're all the same in the end. We are all the same. And all of these divisions that we've created on earth are false, because we're one. We are one. All of us. So thank you for listening, and thank you for being here, and always thank you for your questions. I love to talk about things that you want me to talk about. I love you, and I would love to hear your Marian stories, and I'll be talking to you soon. Bye.